Okay, so I'm going to be recording this portion here to post later. This will be kind of short, like I said. So the mental status exam. So when you're working with a client, you are looking at how they're presenting. And if you recall from our burp notes, right, the very first B, B-I-R-P, B is for behavior. And this is the client's behavior, and it includes two parts, remember. It includes what the client is saying and doing, what their behavior is, but it also includes what the counselor is observing. So these are the things you're going to observe, right? You're going to observe the person's appearance, their behavior, their attitude, their level of consciousness. So in other words, are they alert? Are they drowsy? Are they attentive? Are they distracted, right? You're going to actually inquire in some form or fashion as to their orientation. And so a lot of times on my burp notes, I will say that the client is oriented ×4. And basically what that means is they know who they are, they know where they are, they know what the date is, and they know the situation that they're in, right? So that's oriented ×4. So they basically they have an understanding of what is happening. Now, it says inquired. It doesn't necessarily mean that you ask them every single time you see them, what is today's date, right? Although, if you're doing an official mental status exam, there are a series of questions that you will ask. I'm not going to have you do that. For the purposes of the burp note, you're just observing and listening to them, and based on their narrative, you're going to know if they are oriented or not. Speech and language. So how does their speech and language appear? When it comes to speech, is it rapid? Is it slow? Is it monotone? Is it pressured? And when it comes to language, what kind of words are they using, right? How are they speaking? You know, like I have one client that every other word out of his mouth is an F-bomb. He doesn't even realize he's doing that. But that's an example of something you may observe. Mood is inquired. So in other words, this is what the client says their mood is, right? So the client you might ask them, so how are you feeling today? Oh, I'm in a really good mood. And if their affect, which is what you observe, is smiley, direct eye contact, kind of cheerful, and they say that they're in a good mood, you could put both of those items and that they're congruent. In other words, they match. Some other things you're going to look at is their thought processes. Some of this is you're going to be observing them. Some may be inquired. In other words, as you're using your interventions, as you're talking with them, you will get a sense of what their thought process is and their thought content, because they're basically going to be telling you. Something else that's really important too is assessing suicidality and homicidality. In other words, SI, suicidal ideation, HI, homicidal ideation. That is inquired, especially if they come in, they report that they're really sad or they're despondent, or, you know, it is really important that that we ask those kinds of questions. In the video, which you will be watching, you will see the counselor actually inquire into that, because the man is very upset. And so she says something to the effect of, you know, I just have to ask you, are you having any thoughts of harming yourself? And the other thing you'll notice from the video is his brother had committed suicide within a year. So when you hear something like that, that puts your client at a higher risk of suicide. So just being aware of that stuff. So you want to inquire as to SI and HI. You're also going to be looking at insight and judgment. And this is also part of, as you're writing your TTM stages of change paper, a person who is pre-contemplative, for instance, regarding their substance use disorder, their insight's probably pretty low. So that's just another example. Attention span, their memory, and when it comes to memory, are they able to tell you about recent events? Are they able to tell you about events from the remote past or from earlier in their childhood? You know, do they have difficulty with memory? Sometimes you can ask that directly. Sometimes you'll get a hint of that when you're doing other assessments and they say, you know what, I just don't remember. And that might give you a clue to inquire a little bit more. And then intellectual functioning is another thing that you may look at. Now, as substance use counselors, you're not necessarily going to do any, what's the word I'm looking for, assessments on intellectual functioning. That's usually done by a master's level or a PhD level or PsyD level clinician. But you can get an idea as to some level of intellectual functioning, which may require you to maybe talk to the client about a referral just for further assessment if needed. Same thing with suicidality or any depression or any co-occurring things that may come up. So, all right. So before I move to the next slide, does anybody have any questions about this? And we're going to hit on this again next week as well when we review the video.
I have a question, Professor.
Yes, sir.
I was just wondering regarding suicide ideation. Would you see it as a requirement for the counselor to ask regarding suicide ideas when the individual has not brought that subject up and there's no, there's no mention of depression, no mention of suicide in any other context? In other words, do you check that simply because it's drug addiction?
Well, drug addiction does increase the risk factors for SI and HI. That is a risk factor. So to answer your question, this is really, really important, especially in the very beginning. When you are first working with a client and doing those early assessments, yes, you must ask about SI, HI, history of that, family history of it. You should ask that. Now, as the client comes into your program and there's no history, in other words, they're low risk, are you going to ask about it every time you meet with them? No, you're not. But remember, the paper that I'm preparing you and setting you up for is to do a diagnostic summary, and that's an early type of assessment. This is something you would do with a client in the very beginning of their program. So yes, you would ask then. If someone is high risk, let's say they do come in with a history of suicide attempts or family history of suicide, and they report, and you have other factors, then as the program, you guys could decide how often you are checking in with the client. There is the Columbia, what San Diego County requires for all drug medical and county funded programs is to use the Columbia Suicide Severity Index. And it's a 2-page front and back. It's 1 page, but it's front and back that inquires into a client's suicide history. If they are high risk, then that needs to, and an LPHA needs to review that, whether it's high risk or low risk. If they're high risk, then what needs to happen is that person, we are going to check in with that person more frequently. As a matter of fact, there's another form that the Columbia Suicide Severity Index uses that you can do on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. You can use it any frequency you want because it goes, the way it's listed is, since the last session, have you experienced any of these things? So someone who is very high risk, you may do this every session. Someone who is low risk, You might be doing it in the beginning. I mean, you should do it at the beginning with everyone. Pardon my tongue twisting and tripping over my tongue. You should do this with everyone in the beginning. Low risk, it's going to be less frequent. High risk, it's going to be more frequent. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions on that? That was a good question. And we are actually going to dive into suicidal ideation more deeply later on in the semester. But this is definitely a place where we touch on it, so I wanted to talk about it. All right, any other questions? All right. So this video debrief is what we will do next week, because I will want you guys to talk about what you saw in the video, what you might try yourself, what you might do differently, what else you might need to do to be successful in an initial assessment. So I will want you to watch the video and then just kind of answer these questions. And like I said, I will send that out in an email.
If I may, one more thing.
Sure.
Is all of this also available in Spanish? I mean, if I had to do this in Spanish and I couldn't remember a word, are there forms?
Oh,
example,
yes, there are. Yes.
For the mental status exam, everything's in Spanish without me having to think,
yeah,
what the hell does that word mean?
Yes, yes, yes. You
Okay.
can find Spanish versions of it, definitely. And I'm pretty sure, don't quote me, although I'm being recorded and this will be on YouTube, so I guess I'll be quoted anyway. But I believe that that there are different versions that are available, Spanish and English. And in San Diego County, I forget how many languages they have translators for. There's quite a few. And San Diego County has translated a lot of their documents into multiple languages.
Okay.
So
thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So now we're talking about chapter 4. I'm going to run through this kind of briefly. This is also going to be in your next homework section and in your reading. I really want to get through this part to talk about the DSM-5 and the criteria for diagnosing a substance use disorder. So, all right, let's see here. Okay, so one of the things that's really, really important when you are beginning your practice is to, and this is one of the competencies that you will read about in the book, is that that clinicians need to understand the established diagnostic criteria for SUDs and to be able to describe the treatment modalities and placement criteria. So in other words, you're assessing a client, you need to be able to diagnose them, and then be able to place them in an appropriate level of care. It says continuum of care, but level of care is the same thing. And then be able to describe a variety of helping strategies for reducing the negative effects of substance use disorders, and then tailor helping strategies and treatment modalities to the client's stage of dependence, change, or recovery. So, you know, you're writing the paper on stages of change. There's also stages to recovery, right? There's early, middle, and late stage recovery. We probably won't really get into that too deeply in this semester, but I just want you guys to be aware and understand that, and some of you may already be aware of that. Another competency is to provide treatment services that are appropriate to the personal and cultural identity and language of the client. And again, in San Diego County, there are translation services that are available. And when you write burp notes in the future, I'm not having you practice this now. I've kind of left that out. We did talk about it when I talked about burp notes. But you have to indicate what language the service was provided in if it was not English, and who did the translating. So just be aware of that. And San Diego County has translation services available for clients if you do not have a clinician on site that speaks a particular language. And then, of course, adapt practice to the range of treatment settings and modalities. So it's really talking about flexibility here. Be familiar with medical and pharmacological resources in the treatment of SUDs. So when I see this, I'm thinking of things like MAT, which is medically assisted treatment, that can help with a client's recovery. And then understand the variety of insurance and health maintenance options that are available. So most of our clients, most of the clients you'll work with, if they have it, will probably be drug Medi-Cal. And then recognize that crisis may indicate underlying, ooh, excuse me. Told you my cough was acting up tonight. All right. And that there may be a window of opportunity for change. You know, it's interesting. The window of opportunity to get clients into treatment from the time they make that phone call asking for help to the time they get into treatment is very, very limited. And what I mean by that is that we have to strike the hammer, you know, while the iron's hot, right? Strike the iron while it's hot. Otherwise, you lose the opportunity to help that client. They kind of disappear. I'm sure some who have already been working in the field are familiar with that as well. And then understand the need for and the using methods for measuring treatment outcomes. And this is really, really important. How do we know that the interventions we're using work? I loved the presentation on parent care that talked about their surveys from 2016. That's one example of measuring treatment outcomes. And it's really important because if we're doing something and it's not working, we need to make a change. All right. Okay, so let's kind of put all the pieces together, right? So when your client enters treatment, they'll complete a program orientation. And orientation should tell them what are the rules, what are the expectations, what services will be provided, what services are not being provided. This is when you're going to work out authorizations to disclose information, or otherwise known as ROIs or releases of information. This is also when you tell them if they have a grievance, what are the grievance and appeals process? Because remember, I've said before, clients have rights, and if we wrong them, whether intentionally or not, you know, they have the right to file a grievance. So these are all the different kinds of things that you would be talking about in an orientation. Getting them introduced to their counselor, to their group facilitators, giving them a schedule, touring the facility, whatever it is that they need for orientation. Then they'll also complete an assessment. So we've talked about assessments before. One example is the Addiction Severity Index, the ASI. We use those here where I work. I also conduct behavioral health assessments, BHAs, which is basically you're taking a whole client history. And based on that history, you render diagnoses. What is their substance use disorder? I also render mental health diagnoses. The MSE, the mental status exam, that's what we just talked about. This is also included in the early assessments. Also, this is where the ASAM criteria comes into play, and I will be talking about the ASAM criteria either next week or the following week. So I'm going to do a lecture on the ASAM criteria. Good job. I forget who it was. I think it was Guadalupe who shared their ASAM level of care that they do at the MAC project, right? She talked about ASAM level of care 3.1, which is low intensity residential treatment, and then 3.5, which is a higher level of care and residential treatment, but as she said, it's under psychiatric level of care. So there's a 4.0, which would be psychiatric care. So there are different levels of care, and I will be talking about that. And then finally, the assessment also helps to determine the client's DSM5 substance use disorder diagnosis. And then notes within the treatment record must consistently tell the story. Here you will see golden thread again. We talked about the golden thread before. And basically what that means is that the client's assessment is what guides their ASAM score, that guides the diagnosis, and that guides the treatment goals. And all of this needs to be reflected in the progress notes. So if you remember from the first lecture on the second week, I gave a pretty thorough lecture on documentation and the golden thread. So, and it is posted, so if you want to re-review it, you can. All right, so let's talk about the DSM-5. So in the DSM-5, there are currently 10 classes of substances. I want to talk about some of the changes from the DSM-4 TR to the DSM-5. We're going to talk about the 11 diagnostic criteria. I actually have an example paper I want to show you. And then substance-induced disorders and intoxication and withdrawal. This we will probably hit next week. We're not going to have time to do that tonight because I really want to get you guys out by 7 p.m. So we're just going to focus on this area. All right, so we have alcohol, caffeine, cannabis. That is all listed in there. Yes, there is a caffeine use disorder diagnosis. Hallucinogens, inhalants, opioids, sedative hypnotics, stimulants, tobacco, and others, right? So just know that all of these classes are included in the DSM-5 and you can render diagnoses on them. Now, I've said this before and I'm going to repeat it now. The training that we give you here at City College, and when you graduate with your certificate or your AS degree in alcohol and other drug studies, does give you, it is within your scope of practice to render a substance use disorder diagnosis. Hands down. However, the state of California and San Diego County says that it must be an LPHA that actually renders the diagnosis. So we're still teaching you all of this. At some point, hopefully this will change and the state will recognize substance use counselors with a license that gives, you know, the same level of diagnosing scope of practice that are given to LPHAs. I think we have an excellent program. This next paper that you're doing is all about teaching you how to render a diagnosis and what a good diagnosis looks like. So even though when you get out into the field, if you're working for a county or state-funded program, you won't be signing diagnosis determination notes because it's considered by the state outside your scope of practice. However, you have been trained in it and it is within your scope. You just can't get paid for it, if that makes sense. So not to be a Debbie Downer right now, but I just want you to be aware of that difference. All right. Let's see. A couple of things that I do want to talk about. This slide talks about the differences, what was added. For instance, DSM-5 In DSM-4, we used to diagnose it was either substance abuse or substance dependence. And what they did was they really got rid of that. There is no substance abuse diagnosis or substance dependence diagnosis. What it is, it's a substance use disorder diagnosis, and it's classified as mild, moderate, or severe. So that's where we're at today. So mild, moderate, and severe. Another thing that I do want to remove from your language, if you've been around for a while, you will recognize this down here at the very bottom, that the DSM-5 removed two things. First thing they removed is polysubstance dependence. So you cannot use polysubstance dependence in any of your diagnosing. Don't use it in your clinical language. Just forget about it. You should be listing what substances that they are using. They're using methamphetamine and heroin together. They're using, alcohol, methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin, right? So you want to kind of list it all out and if necessary, render a diagnosis on each substance. So this, again, polysubstance dependence, you can't use it anymore. The other thing that they took out is recurrent legal problems from the diagnostic criteria. So, so if somebody keeps getting in trouble for, public intoxication or whatever, that's it's the public intoxication that's the issue. It's not that they got arrested for it. So you really need to be careful when you're describing that in your diagnostic summary. So don't use recurrent legal problems. It's no longer a valid diagnostic criteria. All right. So in the previous version, the DSM-4, if a person met one criteria, that's all they had to meet, they could be diagnosed with abuse. If they met 3 or more criteria, they could be diagnosed with dependence. That is no longer true. That has been changed because it is now on a continuum of mild, moderate, or severe. So 2 or more means that they meet a substance use disorder, but that would be a mild disorder, right? So 3 to 5 is 4 or 5, sorry. 2 to 3 is mild, 4 to 5 is moderate, and 6 or more is severe. So just be aware of that continuum if you weren't already. I'm sure you've heard this before. This, I'm hoping, is a review. All right, so let's look at the 11 diagnostic criteria. So first of all, here's the definition, right? So it's a problematic pattern of substance use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress as manifested by at least 2 of the following occurring within a 12-month period. So this is another very important thing about the diagnostic criteria. It has to be during the past 12 months. Now, don't get me wrong, take a complete history. It's important to know that they've been using methamphetamine for 26 years. But you're going to base your diagnosis on the criteria that they have experienced within the past 12 months. And this is kind of like what I've just said, but just highlighted. So a pattern of impairment or distress of at least 2 within the past 12 months. All right, so the first 4 criteria are under a heading of impaired control. So the first 4, using large amounts for longer or larger amounts or for longer than intended, a persistent desire or unsuccessful attempts to cut down or control their use, great deal of time obtaining, using, or recovering from using, and craving or strong desire or urge. So that's the first four. Then social impairment. So substance use that is occurring that results in the failure to fulfill a major role obligations at work, school, or home. Continued use despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems. And then important social or occupational or recreational activities are given up. So that's under social impairment. That's the next three criteria. Followed by risky use. So remember earlier I said that they took out recurrent legal problems. If you have a client that has been arrested for DUI 3 times in the past year, I had one of those, he would fall under this category, right? Recurrent use in situations which is physically hazardous. Drinking and driving is physically hazardous. So you could use his arrests to indicate this, but it's not because of the legal problems. It's because he's putting himself or others in danger. So that's one example. Substance use is continued despite the knowledge of having persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problems that's likely caused or exacerbated by the substance use. And finally, pharmacological criteria. So that's tolerance and withdrawal. So tolerance means they need more to achieve the same effect, or using the same amount doesn't do anything for them. And withdrawal is, one of two things. They're either continued use to avoid withdrawal, or when they do stop using, that they experience some kind of withdrawal symptoms. All right, so I'm going to share something.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So with the DSM-5s, I've seen the big book,
Yes.
It looks like a dictionary almost. And
Yes.
then I've seen a desk reference. What are the difference between the two books?
Oh, very good question. And I actually own both.
Okay.
So the difference is the big book that contains everything. That's the full version. So if you look at DSM-5 and you open it up, it's going to give you statistics in there. It's going to tell you there's a bunch of write-ups about how to use the criteria, what to look for, what not to look for. It does not say anything about appropriate treatment. So that's one thing I do want to emphasize.
Okay.
The mini version, the desktop version, all it does is each section, it just gives you a list of the criteria without all the background, without all the other stuff to look at.
So as counselors / case managers, which one would you recommend for us to have, both of them or one of them? Because I know some facilities have the books on hand, but for us, for personal use,
yeah.
Which one do you recommend to have no matter what?
Well, here's what I will say about that. When I was in the AODS program 12 years ago, I bought the DSM-4 TR. And I bought it because I wanted it for my own personal use. And I found that I really didn't use it a whole lot.
Okay.
Because as a substance use counselor, here's the thing. We can only diagnose from the substance use disorder pages, and the rest of it is useless to us. It's outside of our scope. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you buy it at this point. However, here's what I will say. If you have the extra money and you really want to buy it, and I knew I was going to go and do more education, so I ended up, I bought it. I didn't use it right away. By the time I got into grad school, it changed to the DSM-5, and so what I had bought was not even valid anymore.
Right.
If you want to buy one, maybe just buy the smaller desk reference.
Okay.
Because it gives you a nice layout of the criteria for all of the different things you'll be looking for. That's the one I think at this stage would be probably beneficial. and not too
Okay, thank you.
expensive. Yeah. Because the big book, I will tell you, is about $150.
Yeah, I just looked it up on Amazon just to look at it, and the Amazon Prime value, it's $134.
Yeah, yeah,
But the desk reference one is about half that.
yeah, yeah. So, and usually when we met in person, I always brought my books in. Obviously, we can't do that, so you can't look at them. But I
Right.
always brought my books in and let the students look at them and then decide. But I wouldn't buy the big one.
Okay.
Yeah,
All
not
right.
now.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, so I'm going to share. No, that's not what I wanted to share. Hold on. Hold on. Actually, it is what I wanted to share. So I'm going to share a DSM-5 evaluation and just go through this real quick and let you guys go for tonight, and we'll hit on it again more next week. But I wanted to give you an idea of what this is actually a paper I graded because you can see my things on the side. So here's an example of rendering evidence for the criterion. So here you see under impaired control, remember, so impaired control is criteria 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what the student did when they wrote this up is they listed the criteria, the criterion, defined it, and then remember AEB. AEB, as evidenced by, is your friend. You always need to have this. It's really good if you can get client statements. So here's an example. Substance is taken in larger amounts than was intended, as evidenced by, quote, when I have more than one drink, I often find myself a bit more tipsy than I had planned on getting. That is a beautiful statement of how to meet this criteria. Here's another way you can meet this criteria. I had a client that would describe buying an 8-ball and then divvying it up. And okay, I'm going to use this on Monday. I'm going to use this on Tuesday. I'm going to use this on Wednesday, right? He would divvy it up. And by Wednesday, his Saturday sack was gone because he could not, it was always his intent, I'm going to do this, 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 and this. And he was always blowing through that. So this can be, I will say this can be a hard criteria to meet when you're actually talking to clients because it can be hard to get an accurate statement out of them. But this is a great statement here. So for criterion 2, persistent or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control, as evidenced by, quote, I meant to keep no alcohol in the house, but I had a bottle hidden. So what they're saying is, you know, I was trying to control it. I would keep it out of the house, but I ended up bringing it in anyway. And I was not going to drink on that trip, but my husband was stressing me out. There's another example. Criterion 3, great deal of time spent in getting, using, or recovering from using, as evidenced by, I have really bad hangovers in the morning and it takes me hours to get out of bed. Criterion 4, craving or strong urge, as evidenced by, I feel like if I'm going out, I need to have at least a few drinks in order to have fun. Another statement is I can't wait to have a drink after a stressful day. Another example of this is somebody constantly thinking about drinking, right? They're like watching the clock. Oh, it's 5 o'clock. It's almost happy hour, right? Getting a little antsy. All right, so let's look at social impairment. So under social impairment, we have recurrent use resulting in role obligation failure at work, school, or at home, as evidenced by, and here's the quote, sometimes I can't deal with the kids coming over, especially if I'm hungover. So here's another thing too. I'm wondering if the kids coming over means that they're divorced and what caused that divorce. So that could be another thing you may want to investigate. Criterion 6, continued use despite social or interpersonal problems. Okay, well, that didn't make sense what I just said. But my husband and I fight over my drinking, but he's learned to just keep his mouth shut. So she's talking about her interpersonal problems. Her and her husband are fighting. Risky use. Now, remember there are 2 criteria for risky use, right? So in this particular case, criterion 8 was not met, so it's not listed. And criteria 8, remember, is drinking or using that puts you, while engaging in activities that could put you physically at risk, right? So like drinking or driving, or using marijuana and then working on a construction site, or you know, operating heavy machinery, or even engaging in unsafe sex practices, right? Could be a sign, especially if somebody is doing that a lot, or acting as a sex worker in order to support their habit. That's also something that might be an issue. Okay, I just got a message. My internet is unstable, so hopefully you guys are still hearing me well. We're almost done. Pharmacological indicators, remember tolerance. Now this statement here says, I used to be able to drink 1 martini when I was younger and feel wasted, but now I have to drink a few shots of vodka to feel anything. So that does indicate tolerance, but based on what I was talking about before, does anybody see a problem with that statement that I did not catch before?
Well, a martini has a lot of shots in it.
It's not within 1 year.
Yeah, exactly. It's the time period. Because this is great history, but it may not meet the criteria. I would need more information to ensure that this meets the criteria, because it's within the 12 months. Exactly. So if this said, you know, a year ago or in the past year, my drinking has really taken off and I've needed more and more, you know, something like that. Sometimes, again, you just kind of have to really, to get this criteria, you may have to talk to your client for an hour, hour and a half, depending on their level of insight, stuff like that. The other thing I often use in getting criteria, and I'm kind of scanning back up through here, is client statements are great, but you don't always have it. But if you have collateral information, like I get probation reports, and that gives me information that can be used to render a diagnosis as well. So if they've been arrested for DUI in the past year, I know they've been drinking and driving. I may talk to them about it and get a statement from them, but if they are pre-contemplative and don't see it as a problem and deny it, I may indicate that they've denied it. However, they've been arrested for this. That's indicative of them drinking and driving, and therefore they meet that criteria. Does that make sense? It's not because they got arrested, it was because of the behavior. So remember, you may have more than one source in order to render your diagnosis. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. And then the last criteria, withdraw. Here's a great statement. I feel a little shaky in the morning sometimes, but a shot of vodka perks me up. Right. So what they're doing is they're staving off withdrawal symptoms. They're experiencing alcohol withdrawal, taking a shot, helps alleviate that withdrawal symptom. So, all right, so that's all I'm going to go over tonight. So this is what your next paper will kind of look like. I'm going to go into more detail next week, but I just kind of want to introduce the diagnostic criteria and to introduce sort of what I'm going to be looking for in your papers. Because you're making up this client, you know, you're probably more likely to have statements like this. I want you guys to think of some really good statements and create a really good diagnosis for this individual. But like I said, we'll talk more about that. Any other questions before we end? All right, so I'm going to stop. Let's see. I'm going to stop. Oops.